When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I was leaving behind the chaos of city living and stepping into a quiet, wholesome community where a man could work his land in peace, care for his animals, and build something meaningful without endless interference. My house sat on the edge of the subdivision, technically still inside the boundaries of the homeowners association, but with a large enough lot that I could maintain a small-scale farm project. I had chickens, about 30 hens and a few roosters, and they were more than just a personal hobby. These birds were part of a state-approved agricultural grant program designed to encourage sustainable farming practices and provide fresh produce and poultry products to local schools and community food banks. I had applied for the program months earlier, gone through all the paperwork, and attended the necessary workshops. After inspections and verifications, the state awarded me funding and resources to expand my setup, purchase feed, and build proper coops. For me, the project represented not only a chance to give back but also a pathway to supplement my income and keep my life tied to the land I loved. The chickens were legally protected under the grant, and my farm project had official documentation to prove it. From the beginning, though, I noticed a storm brewing in the form of one neighbor, a woman named Karen who lived 3 houses down but made it her personal mission to involve herself in everyone else's business. She was exactly the type you'd expect, short blonde hair, expensive-looking sunglasses perched on her head, always marching around with a clipboard at HOA meetings as if she were leading a military operation. She thrived on rules, regulations, and the feeling of authority, even though she was just a volunteer committee member with no actual power beyond what the HOA board allowed. She had made her presence known on my very first week when she stopped me in the driveway, demanding to know whether I planned to repaint my fence because its shade of brown didn't match the community guidelines. I brushed her off politely, telling her I had more important things to focus on. That exchange set the tone for what would become months of tension between us. Despite Karen's nosiness, I poured myself into building my little farming venture. Each morning, I woke before sunrise, heading out with a mug of steaming coffee in one hand and a bucket of feed in the other. The chickens greeted me with a chorus of clucks and crows, wings flapping against the crisp air. Their coop was a solid wooden structure, painted barn red, complete with nesting boxes and a fenced-in run where they could peck at the ground and stretch their legs. The sound of the roosters crowing might have irritated some people, but to me, it was music, the sound of life, independence, and purpose. I collected fresh eggs daily, some of which I kept for myself and the rest I carefully packed into cartons for distribution to a local program that partnered with schools. The children loved receiving farm-fresh eggs, and I took pride in knowing my little operation was making a difference. The grant inspectors would occasionally stop by, clipboard in hand, and nod in approval at how well I was maintaining everything. Karen, however, could not stand it. Every time she drove by, she slowed her car and glared at my property as if she were staring down an enemy. Sometimes, when I was outside working, she would march over and lecture me about how this isn't farmland, it's a residential community, or how the HOA doesn't permit livestock. I explained to her more than once that I had state authorization, legal documents, and government support for my project. She didn't care. In her mind, the HOA's petty guidelines overruled state law. She started filing complaints with the HOA board, alleging everything from noise disturbances to health hazards. The board, at first, sent me generic letters reminding me of community standards, but when I responded with copies of my grant paperwork, their tone softened. They couldn't argue against the state program without risking legal consequences. Still, Karen wasn't satisfied. She wanted the chickens gone, and she wasn't going to stop until she got her way. Her campaign escalated over time. She began photographing my property from across the street, snapping pictures whenever she saw me outside feeding the birds or repairing the coop. She called animal control multiple times, though each officer who visited left shaking their head after seeing my spotless, well-kept setup. She even tried to rally other neighbors by spreading rumors that my chickens carried diseases or that their droppings would lower property values. Most of the neighbors ignored her, some even rolling their eyes when she brought it up at community meetings. A few, though, were swayed by her dramatics and began muttering about barnyard smells and farm animals attracting pests. None of them had ever actually walked onto my property to see how clean and efficient it was, but gossip is often stronger than truth. Through it all, I kept my composure. The grant wasn't just a hobby, it was tied to state oversight, meaning I had regular check-ins, detailed reports, and official funding tied to the success of the chickens. As long as I followed the rules, I had nothing to fear. I reminded myself of this every time Karen's complaints landed in my mailbox. Still, it wore on me, having to constantly defend myself against someone who thrived on confrontation. The irony was that the HOA, which was supposed to protect property values and preserve community harmony, was the source of division, tension, and bitterness. Karen was their loudest mouthpiece, but she embodied everything that was wrong with the system: petty power trips dressed up as community service. The breaking point came one cool autumn morning when I found a bright yellow violation notice taped to my front door. The HOA had scheduled a compliance hearing regarding my chickens, citing Karen's repeated complaints. They demanded that I appear at the clubhouse on a specific date to explain the presence of livestock on the property. I laughed out loud when I read it. The sheer audacity of the HOA thinking they had the authority to override a state-backed farming grant was unbelievable. I gathered up my paperwork, the grant approval letter, the inspection reports, the official documentation listing my property as a pilot site for sustainable agriculture, and stacked it neatly in a folder. If they wanted a showdown, I was ready. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the clubhouse with my head held high. Karen was already there, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. The board members sat at a long table, shuffling papers and whispering among themselves. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the kind of sterile environment that made people feel small and controlled. As the meeting began, Karen wasted no time. She stood up, waving her arms dramatically as she launched into a tirade about farm animals running loose, noise pollution at dawn, and the risk of salmonella contaminating our water supply. She painted a picture of my chickens as if they were a marauding plague sweeping across the neighborhood. I stayed quiet, letting her dig her hole deeper. When she finally sat down, breathless from her rant, the board turned to me. That was my moment. I calmly laid out the facts, presenting my grant paperwork, inspection results, and the letter from the state agricultural department that specifically protected my right to operate within residential zones as part of the program. I explained how the grant worked, how my chickens were providing food for schools and charities, and how everything I was doing was legally protected. The board members flipped through the documents, their expressions shifting from stern to uneasy. They couldn't deny the legitimacy of what they were looking at. Finally, one of them cleared his throat and announced that the HOA had no authority to override state law, meaning my chickens were allowed to stay. The decision was final. Karen's face turned bright red, her smug grin vanishing as she realized she had lost. Walking out of that meeting, I felt a surge of satisfaction. I hadn't just defended my chickens, I had defended my right to live the way I chose, free from unnecessary meddling. Karen glared at me from across the parking lot, muttering under her breath, but I didn't care. My birds were safe, my grant was secure, and the HOA had been put in its place. I knew the battle wasn't entirely over, because people like Karen never give up easily, but for that day, I had won. And as I drove home, windows down, the sound of roosters crowing in the distance, I smiled knowing that sometimes the best revenge is simply standing your ground and refusing to be pushed around. In the weeks after that HOA hearing, I noticed a subtle shift in how the neighborhood treated me. Some of the residents, the ones who had quietly rolled their eyes at Karen's antics before, now came up to me with small smiles and a pat on the back. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who lived right across the street, stopped by with a six-pack of beer and told me he admired the way I had handled myself in that meeting. He said most people would have lost their temper under Karen's relentless badgering, but I had kept calm and crushed her with facts. That meant something to him. Others began casually asking me about the chickens, curious about the program, wondering if I really did send eggs to schools and food banks. When I confirmed that I did, I could see the wheels turning in their minds. They weren't just looking at me as the guy with the noisy roosters anymore. They were beginning to see me as someone making a positive contribution, someone whose presence added value to the community rather than detracting from it. Even a few of the skeptical folks softened, especially when I offered them fresh cartons of eggs free of charge. Nothing breaks down fences like the taste of a golden-yolked egg straight from a healthy hen. But Karen was not one to lick her wounds quietly. She doubled down, her obsession with me growing almost comical in its intensity. It became clear that defeating her at the hearing hadn't satisfied her thirst for control, it had inflamed it. She started driving by my house more often, sometimes slowing her car to a crawl as if she was taking notes. At night, I would occasionally catch the faint flash of her phone camera from the sidewalk, no doubt trying to capture evidence of some imagined violation. I kept my property pristine, not giving her a single ounce of ammunition. The grant inspectors who visited monthly always left impressed, their clipboards filled with notes about how clean, organized, and effective my setup was. I almost enjoyed the visits, because every time an official in a state-issued vest showed up, Karen's face would sour from across the street. She hated being reminded that no matter how loudly she screeched, there was a higher authority than her HOA rulebook. It wasn't long before Karen escalated her campaign outside the neighborhood. She began writing letters to the local newspaper, submitting angry op-eds about urban farming run amok. She tried to frame me as a public health hazard, warning that chickens in residential areas were ticking time bombs of disease and vermin. The editor ran her piece once, probably just to humor her, but then quickly printed a counterpiece by a local agriculture professor who praised state farming grants and cited data showing that small-scale poultry projects had virtually no risk when managed properly. If anything, the professor argued, projects like mine were vital for teaching communities about sustainability and food security. That article did more for me than Karen realized. Suddenly, people who had never spoken to me before started waving from their driveways, stopping me on walks, even asking if their kids could come by and see the chickens. I became something of a minor local attraction, the farmer neighbor, who wasn't just doing something quirky but actually part of an official state program. Still, I kept my guard up. I knew Karen wasn't finished. She had too much pride, too much venom in her to simply walk away. And sure enough, one chilly evening as I was closing up the coop, I heard a commotion at the far end of my yard. When I got closer, I saw Karen standing by the fence line, phone in hand, filming my every move. I walked over and asked her what she thought she was doing, and she snapped that she was collecting evidence for the HOA board. I reminded her, firmly, that trespassing onto my property line, even leaning her phone over the fence, was a violation of privacy and could be considered harassment. She smirked and muttered something about, "You farmers thinking you're above the rules." I stared her down until she retreated, but the encounter left a sour taste in my mouth. There was no reasoning with her. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cold beer, I thought about everything. I thought about how absurd it was that a grown man, living in America, had to constantly defend his right to raise a few chickens as part of a government program designed to help the community. I thought about how people like Karen, drunk on the smallest sip of authority, could twist neighborhoods into battlegrounds. And I thought about how far I was willing to go to protect what I had built. I wasn't a man who looked for fights, but I wasn't about to be bullied out of my own home either. If Karen wanted a war, I would give her one, but not by stooping to her level. I had the law, the grant, and common sense on my side. All I had to do was keep winning. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed. Winter set in, coating the rooftops in frost and turning the air sharp and crisp. I built additional insulation for the coop, installed heat lamps to keep the hens comfortable, and continued with my grant reports. The state inspectors praised my ingenuity and even hinted that I might be eligible for an expansion grant the following year. That news thrilled me. An expansion meant more chickens, better infrastructure, maybe even a small greenhouse to grow vegetables alongside the egg program. The future looked bright, and I wasn't about to let Karen steal that from me. But she tried anyway. One morning, I woke to find an official-looking letter from the county taped to my mailbox. Heart pounding, I tore it open, fearing the worst, that somehow Karen had managed to sway local officials against me. Instead, I discovered she had filed a complaint with the county health department, claiming my property was unsanitary and that runoff from my chicken coop was contaminating nearby storm drains. My jaw tightened. The accusation was not only false but insulting. My operation was spotless. I cleaned the coops daily, rotated bedding, and had proper drainage in place, all in compliance with the state grant's strict regulations. Still, the health department had to investigate. The inspector came a few days later, a polite young woman in a county jacket with a clipboard in hand. She walked through the property, asked me a series of questions, and took notes. I showed her every corner of the setup, from the feeders to the drainage system to the composting bins. She seemed impressed, even complimenting me on how organized everything was. After an hour, she closed her folder and said plainly, "This is one of the cleanest small-scale coops I've ever inspected. You have nothing to worry about." Relief washed over me, followed by anger. Karen had wasted county resources, wasted my time, and humiliated herself by pushing yet another baseless complaint. Word spread quickly after that inspection. The county report, which praised my compliance, became public record. Neighbors who had been on the fence about me started openly siding with me, realizing that Karen was nothing more than a meddling troublemaker. Even some of the HOA board members quietly apologized for how much grief she had caused. That didn't stop her, of course. Karen never admitted defeat. Instead, she grew more erratic, more desperate. She cornered people at neighborhood gatherings, ranting about my chickens as if they were a personal vendetta. But the more she ranted, the more isolated she became. For me, though, the battle had turned into something larger than myself. It wasn't just about chickens anymore. It was about the principle of standing your ground when someone with misplaced power tries to control you. Every morning when I walked out to feed the birds, I felt that principle settle into my bones. The chickens clucked and flapped around me, oblivious to the drama, and I realized they symbolized more than eggs or grants. They symbolized independence, resilience, and defiance in the face of tyranny, even the small-town kind. By the time spring rolled around, Karen's crusade against me had turned into something of a neighborhood joke. People started calling her the chicken cop behind her back, whispering it at HOA meetings and chuckling when she launched into another one of her tirades. I could see it in her face every time. She knew she was losing her grip, losing her influence, losing the fear that she thrived on. And nothing enraged her more than seeing me outside in my yard, going about my chores like she didn't exist. The more she tried to assert her control, the more invisible she became. For me, though, life was moving forward at a steady pace. My hens were laying more eggs than ever, the roosters were strutting with pride, and the expansion grant had officially been approved. That meant new fencing, new coops, and even a modest greenhouse where I could grow vegetables to supplement the food donations. My little project had transformed into something bigger than I could have imagined when I first applied for the grant. The state officials were thrilled with my progress, praising me as an example for other farmers and even hinting that they might feature my setup in a case study about sustainable urban farming. The expansion, however, made Karen's blood boil. To her, the sight of construction equipment rolling onto my property was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. She stormed out of her house one morning, arms flailing, shrieking about unauthorized building and illegal structures. The contractors ignored her, having already seen my permits and approvals, but she stood on the curb for nearly an hour, filming them with her phone like she was gathering footage for a court case. When she realized no one was paying her any mind, she stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. It would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. The truth was, the HOA had no authority over my grant-approved structures, and the county had already signed off on my permits. But Karen couldn't accept that. In her mind, every nail hammered into wood was a personal affront, a declaration of war against her precious, community standards. That spring was one of the busiest seasons of my life. Between expanding the coops, planting vegetables in the greenhouse, and managing the original flock, I barely had a moment to rest. But it was good work, the kind that left me exhausted in the best way possible. I would come inside in the evenings, my clothes streaked with dirt, my hands rough from labor, and collapse into a chair with a deep sense of satisfaction. The chickens thrived in their new enclosures, scratching happily in the fresh bedding and laying eggs with bright, strong shells. The greenhouse filled with rows of lettuce, tomatoes, and peppers, their leaves glistening under the artificial lights. And when the first harvest came in, I added baskets of vegetables to my egg deliveries, earning grateful smiles from teachers, parents, and food bank volunteers. It wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a mission. Of course, Karen didn't see it that way. She saw it as an invasion. She ramped up her attacks, filing yet another round of complaints with the HOA, the county, and even the state agriculture office. Each time, officials arrived, inspected my property, and left satisfied. Each time, Karen was left fuming on the sidewalk, clutching her clipboard like a weapon that no one took seriously anymore. I could almost pity her, if she weren't so malicious. Her obsession had turned her into a parody of herself, and the harder she pushed, the more alienated she became from the very community she claimed to represent. Neighbors who once avoided confrontation began openly standing up to her. I overheard one woman telling her to leave the farmer alone and get a hobby. That kind of resistance would have been unthinkable months earlier. It was clear that Karen was unraveling. One night, though, the situation escalated beyond petty complaints. I was asleep when I heard a sudden commotion outside, the panicked squawking of chickens, the frantic flapping of wings. Heart pounding, I leapt out of bed, grabbed the flashlight by the door, and rushed outside. My worst fear hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had opened the coop doors. Hens were scattering across the yard, feathers flying, their cries echoing into the night. My stomach churned with rage as I sprinted to gather them, shining the beam of the flashlight into the darkness, corralling the terrified birds back into the enclosure. It took me nearly an hour to collect them all, and by the end, I was shaking with fury. There was no doubt in my mind who was behind it. Karen. She had finally crossed the line from harassment to sabotage. The next morning, I checked the security footage from the cameras I had installed months earlier, anticipating something exactly like this. And there it was, grainy black and white footage of Karen creeping onto my property in the middle of the night, her hood pulled up over her head, fumbling with the coop latches before scurrying away. The evidence was undeniable. I burned with anger as I copied the footage to a flash drive. It was one thing to shout at HOA meetings, to file false complaints, to glare from across the street. It was another thing entirely to endanger my animals, to tamper with state property funded by taxpayer money, and to put my entire operation at risk. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was criminal. I drove straight to the sheriff's office that morning, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. The deputy on duty watched the footage, eyebrows rising as he saw Karen on screen. He whistled softly and shook his head. "That's breaking and entering, tampering with livestock, and destruction of property," he said. "We'll take it from here." I signed a report, handed over the evidence, and left feeling both relieved and apprehensive. Part of me worried about what would happen when Karen realized the law was finally closing in on her. But another part of me felt vindicated. For months, she had treated me like I was the one breaking the rules, the one who didn't belong. Now, the truth was laid bare. She was the criminal, not me. The fallout was swift. A patrol car pulled up to Karen's house later that week, and officers knocked on her door. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering as Karen was led outside, red-faced and screaming, protesting her innocence. The sight of her being questioned by uniformed deputies was surreal. It was the first time the balance of power had shifted so completely. I watched from my porch, arms crossed, as the woman who had made my life hell finally faced consequences. The sheriff's office issued her a formal citation and a restraining order, barring her from coming within a certain distance of my property. She wasn't arrested that day, but the humiliation alone was punishment enough. After that incident, something in the neighborhood changed permanently. People stopped pretending Karen was just annoying or overzealous. They saw her for what she really was, a bully who had crossed the line into criminal behavior. Some neighbors who had once sided with her came to me, sheepish and apologetic, admitting they had believed her lies at first but now realized she was nothing more than a bitter troublemaker. Frank, my neighbor across the street, raised a toast to me over beers one evening, saying, "You didn't just save your chickens, you saved this whole neighborhood from her tyranny." His words stuck with me. From then on, the chickens became more than just a farm project. They became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that sometimes standing your ground is the only way to stop bullies in their tracks. Every morning when I walked out to the coop, I felt stronger, prouder, more determined than ever. Karen had tried to break me, but instead she had forged me into something tougher. And as the hens clucked around my boots, I knew this battle wasn't just mine anymore, it was a story the whole neighborhood would remember for years to come. After Karen was slapped with that restraining order, you could almost feel the neighborhood exhale, like the air had finally cleared after a long, choking storm. People walked their dogs with a little more ease, children rode their bikes without Karen barking orders about helmets or sidewalk chalk, and the HOA meetings suddenly grew quieter, almost civil, without her voice dominating every conversation. For the first time since moving into that community, I felt what I had been looking for all along, peace. My farm project continued to flourish, and with Karen legally barred from stepping anywhere near my property, I finally had the space to focus on what mattered. The chickens thrived, the greenhouse yielded fresh vegetables by the crate, and my deliveries to local schools and food banks doubled. Teachers sent me handwritten notes from students, thanking me for the eggs and vegetables that brightened their school meals. Food bank volunteers hugged me when I pulled up with cartons stacked high in the back of my truck. I wasn't just surviving Karen's wrath anymore, I was thriving in spite of it. The state agriculture office invited me to a regional conference that spring, asking me to present my project as a model of urban sustainability. I remember standing at that podium in front of a room full of farmers, policymakers, and community leaders, explaining how a single grant and a little determination had turned my small backyard into a hub of productivity. I talked about the challenges, though I left Karen's name out of it, and about how persistence and proper planning could overcome even the worst obstacles. When the audience applauded, I felt a rush of pride that I hadn't felt since I was a younger man, starting my first real job. Here I was, just a homeowner with some chickens, being recognized by people who had been farming their whole lives. The validation was overwhelming, and it made every ounce of stress from the HOA battles worth it. But Karen wasn't gone, not really. Even with the restraining order, her bitterness festered. I would catch glimpses of her from afar, standing at the edge of the block, glaring like a shadow that refused to leave. She wasn't allowed near my property, but that didn't stop her from whispering poison into the ears of anyone who would listen. She complained at HOA meetings about the dangerous precedent my project set. She wrote Facebook posts filled with half-truths and exaggerations, trying to stir up resentment online. For the most part, people ignored her, but every once in a while, one of her posts would find its way to me, and I would shake my head at the sheer desperation in her words. She was clinging to relevance, and the harder she tried, the more irrelevant she became. The difference now was that I didn't feel threatened anymore. I felt untouchable. The law had sided with me. The state had celebrated me. The community had embraced me. Karen's claws had been dulled, her power broken. And that gave me the freedom to dream bigger. With the success of my chickens and greenhouse, I applied for a second-tier grant, this one designed to fund community outreach projects. My proposal was simple: to build a small educational center on my property where local kids could learn about farming, sustainability, and healthy eating. I envisioned workshops where children could collect eggs, plant seeds, and watch vegetables grow. I pictured their faces lighting up with wonder, their laughter filling the air, their hands in the soil instead of glued to screens. When the grant was approved, I nearly cried. Construction on the educational center began that summer. It was a modest building, painted white with wide windows and a pitched roof, but to me, it was a palace. Inside, I set up long tables, shelves filled with gardening tools, and even a few posters teaching about soil cycles and nutrition. Outside, I built a small demonstration garden with raised beds, bright flowers, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Learning through farming." On opening day, a busload of kids from a nearby elementary school arrived, their eyes wide with curiosity. I guided them through the greenhouse, let them feed the chickens, and showed them how to plant lettuce seeds. They asked a million questions, their energy boundless, and I answered every one of them with a smile. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but happier than I had ever been. My little backyard farm had grown into something that touched lives, and nothing Karen could say or do would ever take that away from me. Of course, she tried. She couldn't stand the sight of school buses pulling up to my property, the laughter of children echoing down the street. She lodged new complaints with the HOA, insisting that my property was now being used as a commercial enterprise, in violation of residential zoning. Once again, I countered with documentation, the state grant paperwork, the county permits, the educational outreach approvals. Every letter she sent was met with an official stamp of legitimacy on my side. By now, the HOA board was tired of her antics. They began cutting her off at meetings, reminding her that my project had government backing. I could see the fury simmering in her as she realized she had lost her grip completely. She was no longer the enforcer of community rules, she was the neighborhood nuisance. As the months rolled on, I felt a transformation not only in my property but in myself. I had started this journey just wanting to raise chickens and maybe earn a little extra income. But it had become so much more than that. It had become a fight for principle, for independence, for the right to live without being crushed by petty authority. And through that fight, I had found a sense of purpose I didn't even know I was missing. The kids who visited the center looked up to me like I was some kind of hero, the farmer neighbor, who taught them where their food came from. Parents thanked me for showing their children the value of hard work and patience. Neighbors who once avoided me now stopped by with small gifts, cookies, thank you cards, even offers to help with chores. What had started as a battleground had turned into a community. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost of her former self. Her Facebook rants went unanswered. Her clipboard disappeared. Her allies abandoned her one by one. Eventually, word spread that she had stepped down from the HOA board entirely. The woman who once strutted around like a queen had been reduced to a bitter recluse, peeking through her curtains as the neighborhood carried on without her. I didn't celebrate her downfall, not outwardly, anyway, but I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. I hadn't just won against her. I had outlasted her, outgrown her, and built something she could never destroy. By the time fall arrived again, my property was unrecognizable from the day I first moved in. The coop stood tall and sturdy, filled with healthy birds. The greenhouse overflowed with vegetables. The educational center buzzed with activity every week. And me? I stood taller, prouder, more confident than ever. The struggles with Karen had tested me, but they had also shaped me. They had reminded me that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting fire with fire, but from standing firm, refusing to bend, and letting your success speak louder than your enemies ever could. The final stage of my journey began not with another battle against Karen, but with something far greater than either of us, recognition from the state itself. Word of my educational center and my farm project had spread beyond the county, catching the attention of state officials who oversaw community farming initiatives. One morning, I received a letter with an embossed seal, informing me that I had been selected to receive a special award for outstanding contribution to sustainable agriculture and community outreach. Reading those words, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about chickens anymore. It wasn't about proving a point to an HOA or silencing a neighbor's petty vendetta. It was about legacy. It was about the idea that one man, standing firm in the face of constant resistance, could create something lasting, something that touched lives and set an example for others to follow. The award ceremony was scheduled for late winter in the state capitol, and I was invited to attend as a guest of honor. The day of the ceremony, I dressed in my best suit, the same one I had worn to my sister's wedding years before. As I stood in front of the mirror, I thought about the path that had brought me there, the early mornings in the cold, the endless paperwork for the grant, the constant harassment from Karen, the sleepless nights chasing hens after she tampered with the coop. Every trial, every insult, every false accusation had forged me into something tougher, something stronger. When I arrived at the state building, I was greeted by officials who shook my hand warmly, congratulating me on my work. They spoke about how my little farm had become a shining example of resilience and innovation. Sitting in that hall, hearing my name called, walking up to accept the plaque under bright lights and applause, I felt a sense of vindication so deep it nearly brought me to tears. This was what it had all been for. Not just eggs and vegetables, but a statement that integrity and persistence could outlast spite and small-mindedness. Back home, the plaque found a permanent place on my wall, right above the kitchen table where I had once sat late at night, worrying about what Karen might do next. Now, when I looked at that spot, I saw not fear but triumph. The educational center continued to thrive, with more schools booking visits than I could handle at times. I hired a part-time assistant to help with the tours, a young college student studying agriculture who brought fresh energy and ideas to the program. Together, we expanded the curriculum, adding beekeeping demonstrations and composting workshops. Parents began volunteering, neighbors donated materials, and what had once been my personal fight became a shared mission. The neighborhood that Karen once tried to divide was now united by something tangible, something wholesome, something real. As for Karen, her shadow grew fainter with each passing season. Eventually, the rumors spread that she had put her house up for sale. Whether it was humiliation, loneliness, or just the unbearable sight of my success, I never knew. But one day, a moving truck appeared in front of her house, and just like that, she was gone. No farewell, no apology, no final confrontation, just an empty driveway where her SUV used to sit and a "for sale" sign that vanished within weeks. A new family moved in, friendly folks who waved from the porch and asked if their kids could visit the chickens. It was as if the neighborhood itself had exhaled again, finally rid of the constant poison that had hung in the air for so long. And me? I didn't feel hatred for Karen in the end. I felt something closer to pity. She had wasted so much of her life trying to destroy mine, and in the end, she destroyed only herself. Years later, when I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the coops, I think about that chapter of my life. I think about how close I came to giving up, how tempting it would have been to sell the house and escape the nightmare of living under the watch of a woman obsessed with control. But I didn't run. I stayed, I fought, and I won, not just against her, but against the very idea that ordinary people should bow down to petty authority. The chickens still cluck in the yard, the greenhouse still glows in the evening light, and the educational center still rings with the laughter of children planting seeds in the soil. I am no longer just a homeowner with a backyard flock. I am a farmer, a teacher, a neighbor, and a man who stood his ground. And if my story has taught me anything, it's that sometimes the battles we never asked for are the ones that define us. When the wind carries the sound of roosters crowing across the neighborhood, I smile. It is not just the call of morning, it is the anthem of survival, the music of freedom. It is a reminder that I endured, that I created, that I refused to bend. Karen reported my chickens, tried to erase them, tried to erase me. But in the end, those chickens became part of something larger than her, larger than the HOA, larger than the petty wars of one small neighborhood. They became part of a movement, a lesson, a legacy. And as long as I live, their voices will remind me that victory isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes, it is as simple as holding fast, doing what is right, and letting time prove you right.